Our regular panellist, Michael Kroger, was on Afternoon Agenda on Thursday, and he said, you watch the polls narrow. If Russia invades Ukraine, or well, he even said if China invades Taiwan, do you concede that as unfortunate and terrible as an occurrence as that would be, that could increase the government's chances at the election?
Look, Andrew, I've got the greatest respect for Michael, obviously, and I know Michelle was sort of making similar points before. I've got to say, look, I worry about COVID. I worry about the impact on people. I worry about inflation and the uncertainty economically over the course of the next couple of years. But I worry most, and I've been very public about this, I worry most about the acts of China. I don't want to see Russia go into the Ukraine because of the human cost and the economic impact that it will have on the rest of the world. There's always a ripple effect. But I worry most about the aggression of China. It's a very different country under President Xi, and frankly, I want to make sure that Australia is in a position of strength, which is going to take us some years to build up. We've already started that with AUKUS and the submarines, but there's a lot more to be done. And we're embarking on a path which will make our country stronger. It will mean that we're a stronger ally with the United States, the United Kingdom, with Japan, India, and many other countries who want to avert any conflict in our region as well. And now is not a time for weakness, and the Labor Party is notorious for weakness when it comes to national security.
So you've made this point
focus, frankly, more so than the polls.
You've made this point on weakness with the Labor Party on many occasions, and you've really been hammering Albanese on it. But he met with Anthony Blinken and Kurt Campbell the other week. What's your evidence they would be weaker?
Their whole entire period in government, Andrew, and Anthony Albanese's whole history. Anthony Albanese is the leader of the radical left within the Labor Party. He's the one person standing up at the conference year after year, arguing for an inheritance tax, arguing for the boat policy to be unwound. He stood in the way of leaders, including Kim Beazley, implementing tougher policies, watered down national security positions of the Labor government. We've seen Mark Dreyfus during their whole period in opposition. And in fact, when he was Attorney General in the Rudd-Gillard years, as Attorney General, not introducing national security laws, and then in opposition watering down those laws during the Joint Parliamentary Committee on National Security. So I just think don't look at their rhetoric, because what they do in opposition is always say, we're as strong as the government when it comes to border protection. We'll manage the economy the same as the Liberal Party will. We'll make sure that we invest in defence. Well, we know when they were in government, they stripped billions of dollars out of defence. They didn't order any ships. They didn't order any aircraft. They didn't order any submarines. They took money away from ASIO and from the Australian Federal Police. So don't look at what they say when they're in opposition. Look at what they do when they get into government.
Sure.
And particularly if they're in government again with the Greens, they will have extra pressure to divert money away from defence into other, pleasant causes. All
right. Well, let me ask you, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. What do you make of Mike Burgess and Dennis Richardson's comments? I mean, Mike Burgess was saying it's not helpful that politicians allege one side or the other, more subject to foreign interference, and Dennis Richardson actually said the government's tactics were helping China.
Well, I have the utmost respect for both men, and I know both of them very well. I appointed Mike Burgess to ASIO. He's a first-class public servant, and as is Dennis. And Dennis has been around the space for a long time, and I disagree with the conclusions that they're drawing. I think there is a big difference between the coalition and Labor. I think the public recognise that. The public understand it. They've seen the actions of the Labor Party when they were in government, when they lost control of our borders. I mean, if you can't stare down the people smugglers, how can you stare down the acts of aggression coming out of the Chinese government? All right, that's the fundamental problem for Anthony Albanese.
Mr. Dutton, I mean, were you almost a victim of foreign interference yourself when in 2016 you had a lunch with Huang Zhangmo organised by the lobbyist Santo Santoro? Could it almost be said that, is that not proof, I guess, that both sides of politics can be duped into it?
No, I think there's, first point, Andrew, we have an opportunity to meet many people in this business. And in 2016, the situation with China was very different. I hadn't had a security briefing in relation to that, as you would expect. And The big difference now is that in 2022, China under President Xi is heading in a very different direction. And that is known to Anthony Albanese when he turns up to the museum with Bob Carr and Paul Keating, great sympathisers of the Communist Party in China and the Chinese government. And he turns up probably without advice or against advice, I'm not sure. Whether he even sought the advice, but it's a very different situation now.
He says he did seek the advice. He says he did.
In 2016.
Mr Dutton, he said he did seek advice.
So he says.
From Mike Burgess.
So he says, Andrew. So he says.
Do you believe otherwise?
So he says.
Do you believe otherwise?
I would just look at their acts. Okay, I would look at their actions. Now look at what they do when they're in opposition. They tell, as Kevin Rudd did, and Anthony Albanese was very close, trained under Kevin Rudd. He knows the formula. Kevin Rudd's run-up in 2007 was to say he was no different to John Howard economically or on national security. They were as weak as water. They took money away from defence and the agencies. They allowed the boats to restart. People drowned. And if you can't manage our borders, you can't manage the national security. And Scott Morrison and I have demonstrated a complete opposite on that spectrum to what the Labor Party provided. We have secured our borders. We did stop boats. We stopped drownings at sea. We got kids out of detention. And we are investing in our defences of this nation. We're in a very different situation than any period since the Second World War. And if people want to pretend otherwise, then really they're not looking at the facts that are presented before them. And Australia is not going to stare down a bully in our region from a position of weakness. And that's the position, that's the ground that Anthony Albanese would occupy. And it's not the ground that this government has adopted. And we will work closely with our partners, as we've demonstrated through AUKUS, through Quad and through other collaborations. We will make sure that we maintain peace, and that needs to be the absolute objective, and it is of this government.
All right, Mr Dutton, just finally, will you put your hand up for the leadership if the government loses the election?
Andrew, look, again, I've been very clear on this. I think we are going to win the election because as I move around in my electorate, speaking to people in the suburbs, in other marginal seats around the country, people don't want a change of government. They might be unhappy with us on bits and pieces of what the government's done or hasn't done over the course of COVID, but nobody had a copybook as to every response being perfect. And, the Prime Minister's a human being like the rest of us. We all make mistakes, but people realise that there is a lot at stake at this election. We can't risk the economic recovery out of COVID. We can't risk the national security settings of our country. The decisions that we make today and over the next few years will be the difference between whether we are prepared to respond to any acts of aggression over the next 10 and 20 years. And that's why I think we can win the election. It's why I think Scott Morrison will remain the Prime Minister going into the next term. And with respect, it's what makes your question redundant. But thank you for asking it on a Sunday morning, Andrew.
Mr Dutton, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, mate.